Chapter 4. The Navel of the Earth. He is the God who sits in the center, on the navel of the earth, and he is the interpreter of religion to all mankind. Plato. But at the navel of the earth stands Agni, clothed in richest apparel. Rig Veda. To whom then will ye liken God? It is he that sitteth upon the chug of the earth, and the inhabitants thereof are as grasshoppers. Isaiah. After proceeding some distance, we paused to take a breath where the crowd was more dense and obstinate than usual, and I was seriously informed that this was the exact navel of the earth, and that these obstinate pilgrims were bowing and kissing it. The Land and the Book. Jedes Volk hat einen Nebel der Erde. Kloiker. Students of antiquity must often have marveled in the nearly every ancient literature that should encounter the strange expression of the navel of the earth. Still more unaccountable would it have seemed to them had they noticed how many ancient mythologies connect the cradle of the human race with this earth navel. The advocates of the different sites which have been assigned to Eden have seldom, if ever, recognized the fact that no hypothesis on the subject can be considered acceptable which cannot account for this peculiar association of man's first home with some sort of natural center of the earth. Assuming, however, that the human race began its history at the pole, and that all traditional recollections of man's unfallen state were connected with the polar Eden, the mystery which otherwise envelops the subject immediately vanishes. We have already seen that the term navel was anciently used in many languages for center, and that the pole, or central point of the revolving constellations, was the navel of heaven. But as to the celestial pole, there corresponds a terrestrial one, so it is only natural to the term the navel of heaven, there should be corresponding expression, the navel of the earth. Beginning with the Christian traditions, let us make a pilgrimage to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre at Jerusalem. There, in the portion belonging to the Greek Christians, we shall discover a round pillar, some 2 feet high, projecting from the marble pavement, but supporting nothing. If we inquire as to its purpose, we shall be informed that it is designed to mark the exact center or navel of the earth. Early pilgrims and chroniclers refer to this curious monument, but its antiquity no one knows. As usually described, it is a monument of the geographical ignorance of those who placed it there, a proof that they supposed the edge of the flat disk of the earth to be everywhere equidistant from this stone. In reality, it is a monument of primeval astronomic and geographic science. To find the true symbolical and commemorative character of this pillar, we need to remind ourselves of a tendency ever present and active among men. We have already alluded to the scores of calvaries which have been set apart in Roman Catholic lands, and hallowed as memorial mounts. Up the side of each leads a Via Dolorosa, with its different stations, each recalling to the mind, by sculptured reliefs or otherwise, one of the immortal incidents of the Passion. On the summit is the full crucifixion tableau, the Savior hanging aloft upon the cross, between 2 crucified malefactors. The spear, the reed with the sponge, the hammer, all are there, sometimes the ladder also, and nearby the tomb wherein never man was laid. In the minds of the worshippers it is a holy place. Even in our Protestant Republic, on the shore of Lake Chautauqua, we have seen successfully carried out, in our own day, a complete reproduction of Palestine. Thousands have visited it to object lessons in sacred geography. From it, these thousands have gained clearer ideas of the relative positions and bearings of Hermon and Tabor and Olivet, of Kedron and Cherith and the Jordan, of Nazareth and Hebron and the Holy City, than else they ever would have had. What here has been done for purposes of instruction has elsewhere and often upon a greater or smaller scale been done for purposes of direct religious edification and for the gratification of religious sentiment. Now, just as Christians love to localize in their own midst their holy places, so the early nations of the world loved to create miniature reproductions of Eden, the fair and sacred country in which man dwelt in the holy morning hours of his existence. The traditional temple architecture of many early religions was determined by the symbolical and commemorative motive. This was eminently true of the sacred architecture of the Babylonians, Egyptians, Hebrews, and Chinese. Kopin assures us that every orthodoxy constructed Buddhist temple either is, or contains, a symbolical representation of the divine regions of Meru, and the heaven of the gods, saints, and Buddhas rising above it. Lilly says, the 13 pyramidal layers at the top of every temple in Nepal represent the 13 unchangeable heavens of Amitabha. With what astonishing elaboration this idea has sometimes been carried out may be seen in the Senbyu Temple in Mengun, near the capital of Burma. That the natural features of the landscape were often utilized in producing these symbolic shrines and holy places is only what we should expect. The Buddhists of Ceylon, as Aubrey states, have endeavored to transform their central mountain, Divakuta, or Peak of the Gods, into Meru, and to find 4 streams descending from its sides to correspond with the rivers of their paradise. Again, in the rock-cut temples of Ellora, we have, in like manner, a complete representation of the paradise of Siva. Faber develops the evidence of this practice among the ancients with great fullness, and with respect to the Hindus and Buddhists says, each pagoda, each pyramid, each montiform, high place, is invariably esteemed to be a copy of the holy hill Meru, the Hindu's paradise. From Records of the Past, Volume 10, page 50, we see that the Egyptians had the same custom of building temples in such a manner that they should have been symbolical of the abode of the gods. So in Greece and Rome, the citadel mounts in their cities had quite as great religious as military significance. Lenormant, speaking of Rome and Olympia, remarks, it is impossible not to note that the Capitolone was first of all the Mount of Saturn, and that the Roman archaeologists established a complete affinity between the Capitolone and Mount Kronios in Olympia, from the standpoint of their traditions and religious origin. This Mount Kronios is, as it were, the Omphalos of the sacred city of Elis, the primitive center of worship. It sometimes receives the name Olympos. Here is not only symbolism in general, but also a symbolism pointing to the Arctic Eden, already shown to be the primeval Mount of Kronos, the Olymphalos of the whole earth. Now, as Jerusalem is one of the most ancient of the sacred cities of the world, and, at the same time, the one where the tradition of the primeval paradise was preserved in its clearest and most historic form, it would be strange if, in all its long history, no king or priesthood had ever tried to enhance its attractiveness and sanctity by making it, or some part of it, symbolize Earth's earliest Holy Land, and commemorate man's earliest theocracy. That the attempt was made is beyond a doubt. To this day, the visitor is shown the spot where, according to one tradition, Adam was created. Not many feet away, under the custody of another religion, he finds the sacred rock-hewn grave in which at least the head of the first man was buried. In the Little Gihon, the name of one of the paradise rivers still lives. The miraculous virtue of the pool of Bethsaida was ascribed in early Christian legend to its being in subterranean contact with the tree of life, which grew in the midst of paradise. Christ's cross was said to have been made of wood of the same tree. The very name, Mount Zion, is a memorial one. The Talmudic account of the strength of the Hill of Zion shows that the Palestinian mount was named after the heavenly one, and not vice versa, as commonly supposed. The true sacred name of the holy city is therefore not Zion, though it is often called by the heavenly appellation also, but Daughter of Sion. She is simply a copy, a miniature likeness, of the true mount and city of God in the sides of the north. So confident is Lenormant that Solomon and Hezekiah intentionally confirmed their capital to the paradisaic mount, and intentionally introduced in their public works features which should symbolize and commemorate peculiarities of Eden, that he used the fact as an unanswerable argument against those imaginative critics who would place the composition of the second chapter of Genesis subsequent to the Babylonian exile. He says, "Another proof, and a very decisive one in my opinion, of the high antiquity of the narrative of Genesis concerning Eden, and of the knowledge of it possessed by the Hebrews long before the captivity, is the intention, so clearly proved by Ewald, to imitate the 4 rivers which predominated in the works of Solomon and Hezekiah for the distribution of the waters of Jerusalem, which, in its turn, was considered as the umbilicus of the earth, in the double sense of the center of the inhabited regions and source of the rivers. The 4 streams which watered the town and the foot of its ramparts, one of which was named Gihon, like one of the paradisaic rivers, were, as Ewald has shown, reputed to issue through subterranean communications from the spring of fresh water situated beneath the temple, the sacred source of life and purity to which the prophets attach a high symbolic value." In this citation, in addition to a strong assertion of the symbolical character of the topography and waterworks of Jerusalem, we have the location itself included in the symbolism. The city is said to have been the umbilicus or navel of the earth, for 2 reasons. First, because of its relation to the surrounding countries, and second, because of its containing the source of the rivers. In our next chapter, this last reason will become more significant than ever the writer intended. At present, we will only add that the true philosophy of the symbolical centrality of Jerusalem is found in 2 facts. First, the Hebrews had a tradition that primeval Eden was the center of the earth. And second, by styling Jerusalem as the navel of the earth, as they did, it was symbolically all the more assimilated to the primitive paradise, which in so many other ways is sacredly commemorated. Passing to the field of Hellenic tradition, we are told by all modern interpreters that the Greeks shared the narrow conceit and ignorance of all ancient nations, and supposed their own land to occupy the middle of the flat earth disk. And because of certain expressions in Pindar and a passage in Pausanias, it is affirmed as a first principle in the geography of the ancient Greeks that Delphi was believed to be the exact topographical center point of the whole earth. Such a representation is far from satisfactory, for while the term omphalos of the earth was undoubtedly applied in a sense to Delphi, it belonged to it only as the name Athens belongs to many a town thus designated in America. It had other and older topographical connections and associations. We find traces of the same title in connection with Olympos, with Ida, with Parnassos, with Ogygia, with Nysa, with Mount Meros, with Delos, with Athens, with Crete, and even with Meroe. In the municipality of these localizations, the people seem to have lost the clue to the original significance of the conception, and to have contrived crude etymological myths of their own for the explanation of what seemed to them a remarkable designation. The moment we make the true original omphalos of the earth the North Pole, and invest it with the sacred traditionary recollections of Eden life, all this confusion becomes clear. The center stone of Delphi, like the omphalium of the Cretans, becomes merely a memorial shrine, an attempted copy of the great original. And if all the Olymps and Idas and Parnassos mounts were alike convenient reproductions and localizations of the one celestial mountain of the gods at the North Pole, what wonder if we find each of them in some way designated as the center of the earth? Homer's Omphalos of the Sea, Calypso's Isle, has in like manner all the marks of a mythico-traditional North Pole or Eden. Its name, Ogygia, connects it with a far-off antediluvian antiquity. It is situated in the far north, and Odysseus needs the blast of Boreas to bring him away from its shores on the homeward journey. Its queen, Calypso, is the daughter of Atlas, and Atlas's proper station in Greek mythology, as elsewhere shown, is at the terrestrial pole. Its beauty is paradisaic, it being adorned with groves and soft meadows of violets. So beautiful, in fact, that on beholding it, even an immortal would be seized with wonder and delight. Finally, identifying the place beyond all question, we have the Eden Fountain, whose waters part into 4 streams, flowing each in opposite directions. In Mount Meros, we have only the Greek form of Meru, as long ago shown by Cruiser. The one is the navel of the earth for the same reason that the other is. Egyptian Meroe, in some Egyptian texts Mer, in Assyrian Meruk or Meruka, the seat of the famous oracle of Jupiter Ammon, was possibly named from the same world mountain. This would explain the passage in Quintus Curtius, which has so troubled commentators, wherein the object which represented the divine being is described as resembling a navel set in gems. When the two doves of Zeus, flying from the two opposite ends of the world, determine the cosmic centralness of Parnassos, it is of an antediluvian Parnassos that the myth is speaking. It is that mount on whose popular top we have already found the domicilium of Zeus. Nonos, in describing the symbolical peplos which Harmonia wove on the loom of Athene, says, "First she represented the earth with its omphalos in the center. Around the earth she spread out the sphere of heaven varied with the figures of the stars. Lastly, along the exterior edge of the well-woven vestment she represented the ocean in a circle. That Delphi or the Phocian Parnassos is the omphalos here mentioned is far enough from credible. It is the pole, and the manner in which the term is introduced shows that it was perfectly understood by every reader, and needed no explanation. The true shrine of Apollo was not at Delphi, but in that older earth center of which Plato speaks in the motto prefixed to the section. His real home is among the Hyperboreans, in a land of almost perpetual light, and it is only upon annual visits that he comes to Delphi. The remembrance of this fact would have helped the interpreters of Pindar out of more than one perplexity. According to Hecataeus, Leto, the mother of Apollo, and his sister Artemis, was born on the island in the Arctic Ocean, beyond the north wind. Moreover, on this island inhabited by the Hyperboreans, Apollo is unceasingly worshipped in a huge round temple, in a city whose inhabitants are perpetually playing upon lyres and chanting to his praise. So reports Diodorus, and herewith agrees the imaginary journey of Apollonius of Tyana, a namesake of Apollo, who tells of his journey far to the north of the Caucasus into the regions of the pious Hyperboreans, among whom he found a lofty sacred mountain, the omphalos of the earth. In the Phaedo we have a charming description of Plato's terrestrial paradise. In this fair region, Socrates is made to say, all things that grow, trees and flowers and fruit, are fairer than any here, and there are hills and stones in them smoother and more transparent and fairer in color than are highly valued emeralds and sardonyxes and jaspers and other gems, which are but minute fragments of them. For there all the stones like are precious stones, and fairer still. The temperament of their seasons is such that the inhabitants have no disease, and live much longer than we do, and have sight and hearing and smell and all the other senses in much greater perfection. And they have temples and sacred places, in which the gods really dwell, and they hear their voices, and receive their answers, and are conscious of them, and hold converse with them, and they see the sun, the moon, and the stars as they really are. If we ask as to the location of this divinely beautiful abode, every indication of the text agrees with our hypothesis. It is right under the eye when the world is looked at from its summit, the northern celestial pole. Viewed from the standpoint of Greece and its neighbor lands, it is above. It is the upper earth, the dazzling top of the round world. In it, moreover, is the navel of the earth, Eusoyaya, inhabited by happy men. If anything is needed to disprove the common notion that geographical ignorance and national self-esteem first governed the ancient peoples in locating in their own countries navels of the earth, it is furnished by what is, in all probability, the oldest epic in the world, that of Izdubar, fragments of which have survived in the oldest literature of Babylonia. These fragments show that the earliest inhabitants of the Tigro-Euphrates basin located the center of the earth, not in their own midst, but in a far-off land, of sacred associations, where the holy house of the gods is situated, a land into the heart whereof man hath not penetrated, a place underneath the overshadowing world-tree, and beside the full waters. No description could more perfectly identify the spot with the Arctic Pole of ancient Asiatic mythology. Yet this testimony stands not alone, for in the fragment of another ancient text, translated by Sayce in Records of the Past, we are told of a dwelling which the gods created for the first human beings, a dwelling in which they became great and increased in numbers, and the location of which is described in words exactly corresponding to the of Iranian, Indian, Chinese, Eddaic, and Aztec literature, namely in the center of the earth. In the Hindu Puranas, we are told over and over that the earth is a sphere, and that Mount Meru is its navel or pole. But the expression Nabhi, or navel of the earth, is older than the Puranas, though the very meaning of Purana is ancient. Like the term navel of heaven, it occurs in the hymns of the earliest Veda. But where was the sacred shrine to which it was applied? It was no holy place in Bactria or in the Punjab. Nothing tends to locate it in India. On the other hand, the fifth verse of the 185th hymn, Mandala 1st of the Rig Veda, seems most plainly to fix it at the North Pole. In this verse, night and day are represented as twin sisters in the bosom of their parents, heaven and earth, each bounding or limiting the other, but both kissing simultaneously the Nabhi of the earth. Now, everywhere upon the earth, except in the polar regions, night and day seem ever to be pursuing and supplanting each other. They have no common ground. At the pole, and only there, they may be said, with locked arms, to spin round and round a common point, and untidily to kiss it from the opposite sides. This plainly is the meaning of the poet, and remembering all the legendary splendors of the polar mountain around which sun and moon are ever moving, we must pronounce the figure as beautiful as it is instructive. In perfect accord herewith, we find the bard asking in another hymn where the navel of the earth is, and in doing it he associates it as closely as possible, not with some central home shrine in his own land, but with the extreme end of the earth, an expression used again and again in ancient languages, for the pole and its vicinity. Again, in another Vedic passage, the navel of the earth is located upon the mountains, and this association points us to the north. Still stronger evidence of its polar location is found in other hymns, where the supporting column of heaven, the Atlas pillar of Vedic cosmology, is described as standing in or upon the navel of the earth. Finally, so unmistakable is the Vedic teaching on this subject that a recent writer, after asserting with all his teachers that the cosmography of the Vedic bards was embryonic, and their earth was a flat disk, overarched by a solid firmament, which has soldered onto the edge of the disk at the horizon, nevertheless, later, in studying one of the cosmogonical hymns of the Dirghatamas, the son of Mamata, reaches the conclusion that the singer had knowledge both of the celestial and terrestrial pole, and that, in seeking to answer the question as to the birthplace of humanity, he locates it precisely at the point of contact between the polar mountain and the pole of the northern sky. We have seen that, according to old Iranian tradition also, man was created in the central division of the earth. The primordial tree, which kept the strength of all kinds of trees, was in the vicinity of the middle of the earth. The primeval ox, which stood by the Paradise River when the destroyer came, was in the middle of the earth. Mount Teara, the celestial pole, and Kadak-i-Daitik, the mountain of the terrestrial pole, are each described in similar terms, the one as the center of the world, the other as the center of the earth. The expression Apam-Nepat, the navel of the waters, occurs in the Avestan writings again and again, and is always applied either to the world fountain from which all waters proceed, or to the spirit presiding over it. But as this world fountain, Ardvi Sura, is located in the north polar sky, we have here also a recognition of a world Omphalos, inseparable from the ancient and sacred Paradise Mountain at the pole. The Chinese terrestrial paradise is described not only as the center of the earth, but also as directly under Shangtai's heavenly palace, which is declared to be in the North Star, and which is sometimes styled Palace of the Center. Very probably, the historic designation, the Middle Kingdom, was originally a sacred name, commemorative of that primeval middle country which the Akkadian called Akkad, the Indian Ilvrita, the Iranian Kaviras, and the Northman Idavalor. In the funeral rites of China, this supposition finds a cogent confirmation. Passing to Japan, it is curiously interesting to note that the Ainos, who are supposed to have been the first inhabitants, are believed to have come from the archipelago from the north, that their heaven is on inaccessible mountaintops in the same quarter, and that their name, according to some authorities, etymologically signifies offspring of the center. In burial, their dead are always so placed that when resurrected, their faces will be set towards the lofty northern country from which their ancestors are believed to have come, and to which their spirits are believed to have returned. Taking these facts in connection with those presented in Chapter 2 of the preceding part, one can hardly evade the conclusion that, when Griffiths informs us that the Japanese considered their country as lying at the top of the world, and when others say that the Japanese once regarded their country as the center of the world, it is most probable that these writers have applied to the Japan of today ideas which originally belonged to a far distant prehistoric polar Japan, the primitive seat of the race, and it has lived on these most ancient traditions of the Ainos. In Scandinavian mythology, we meet with a similar idea. In the Eddas, both Asgard and Idavolor are represented as the center of the world, and at least one author, in explaining the reason of it, has come within a hair's breadth of the truth, though missing it. The ancient Mexicans conceived of the cradle of the human race as situated in the farthest north, upon the highest of mountains, the residence of the god Tlaloc. Thence come the rains and all streams, for Tlaloc is the god of waters. The first man, Quetzalcoatl, after having ruled as king of the Golden Age in Mexico, returned by divine direction to the primeval paradise in the north, and partook of the draught of immortality. The stupendous terraced pyramid temple in Cholula was a copy and symbol of the sacred Paradise Mountain of Aztec tradition, which was described as standing in the center of the middle country. Some of the Mexican myths represent the mountain as now crooked or turned partly over. For the true explanation of this, see above, pages 192 to 196. Among the ancient Inca subjects of Peru was found the same idea of a navel of the earth, and even among the Chickasaws of Mississippi. Thus all ancient thought full of this legendary idea of a mysterious, primeval, holy, paradisaic earth center, a spot connected as it is no other with the center of heaven, the paradise of God. Why it should be so, no one has ever told us, but the hypothesis which places the biblical Eden at the pole, and makes all later earth navels commemorative of that primal one, affords a perfect explanation. In the light of it, there is no difficulty in understanding that earth center in Jerusalem with which we began. The inconspicuous pillar in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre symbolizes and commemorates far more than the geographical ignorance of medieval ages. It stands for the Japanese pillar by which the first soul born upon the earth mounted to the sky. It stands for the world column of the East Aryans and the Chinvat Bridge of Iran. It stands for the law-proclaiming pillar of Orichalcum in Atlantis, placed in the center of the most central land. It stands for that Talmudic pillar by means of which the tenants of the terrestrial paradise mount to the celestial, and, having spent the Sabbath, return to pass the week below. It symbolizes Cardo, Atlas, Meru, Heraberezaiti, Karsak Kura, every fabulous mountain on whose top the sky pivots itself, and around which all the heavenly bodies ceaselessly revolve. It perpetuates a religious symbolism which existed in the region before ever Jerusalem had been made the Hebrew capital, recalling to our modern world the Tabor Haaretz of a period anterior to the days of Samuel. In tradition, it is said to mark the precise spot whence the clay was taken, out of which the body of Adam was modeled. It does so, but it does it in a language and method which were common to the most ancient nations of the earth. It points not to the soil in which it stands, but to the holier soil of a faraway primitive Eden. Chapter 5. The Quadrifurcate River. Als ich erfunden han aus dem Paradies ran, zu Füten Baum und Gras, und alles, das darin was. Zu guter Moos ein Wasser groß, das in 4 Teil darnisch floss. Ludwig. Wir haben hier ein merkwürdiges Stromsystem. Grill. And a river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from thence it was parted and became into 4 heads. In Chapter 2 of Part 2, we presented the simple and natural interpretation suggested by the hypothesis of a primitive circumpolar continent. If the reader will kindly turn back to the statement there made, he will see in how natural a manner the water system of that lost land of delights might have become, in after tradition, the one dissipated river which waters the whole earth. The insuperable difficulties of all hitherto attempted identifications of the 4 rivers are too numerous to present here in detail. In our interpretation, the original river is from the sky. The division takes place on the heights at the pole, and the 4 resulting rivers are the chief streams of the circumpolar continent as they descend in different directions to the surrounding sea. Does such a view find any support in the traditions of the ancient world? That it does will be clear to anyone who has carefully read thus far. Let us take the rivers of the Persian cradle of the race. Where do they rise? If the investigator of this question have made no previous studies in comparative sacred hydrography, he will be surprised to find that in the Persian thought, not only the paradise rivers, but also all the rivers of the whole earth, have but one headspring and but one place of discharge. This headspring is the Advisura, situated in heaven, the heaven of the pole. This heavenly fountain, says Haug, summarizing the contents of the Aban Yasht, this heavenly fountain has 1,000 springs and 1,000 canals, each of them 40 days' journey long. Thence a channel goes through all the 7 Kashvaras, or regions of the earth, conveying everywhere pure celestial waters. The following is an ancient invocation to Anahita, the spirit of these heavenly waters. Come before me, Ardvisura Anahita, come down from yonder stars onto the earth created by Ahura Mazda. 3 shall worship the hard-handy lords, the rulers of countries, sons of the rulers of countries. From its elevation, the heavenly height is called Hugar, i.e. the lofty. Hugar, the lofty, is the mount from which the water of Ardvisura leaps down the height of 1,000 men. Again it is written, Hugar, the lofty, on which the water of Ardvisura flows and leaps, is the chief of summits, since it is that above which the revolution of Sataves, the chief of reservoirs. As all the rivers of the earth's 7 regions, so all lakes and seas and the ocean itself are from this one celestial fountain. Through the warmth and clearness of the water, purifying more than other waters, everything continually flows from the source Ardvisura. However named, all waters are simply portions of the same heaven-descending stream. The other innumerable waters and rivers, springs and channels, are one in origin with those, so in various districts and various places they call them by various names. Even plant sap and blood and milk and all the 17 kinds of liquid enumerated in the Yashts are parts of the one cosmic current. All these, through growth, or the body which is formed, mingle again with the rivers, for the body which is formed and the growth are both one. Everything of a liquid nature, therefore, in the whole world is conceived of as proceeding from the source high in the north polar sky. Whither is it tending? What becomes of it all in the end? Where do its myriad rills and rivers at last discharge? According to the cosmological conceptions so often illustrated in these pages, all start from the zenith. We should naturally expect all to reunite at last in the nadir. This is found to be the fact. But in this neither gathering place the waters, now polluted from their contact with all the filth and vileness of the world, are not allowed to rest and accumulate. This cesspool of the universe has a previous bottom. By the various processes of straining, vaporizing, aeration, etc., the polluted waters are by Tishtar brought back distilled and purified, and are redischarged into the zenith reservoir which perpetually supplies the gushing streams of Ardhavisura. Into such a marvelously complete cosmical circulatory water system did the Iranic imagination develop the primitive headstream of Eden. But never, even in the most extravagant mythological adornments of the idea, was it for a moment forgotten that the original undivided stream originates in the North Polar sky, and that its division into earthly streams and rivers is on the holy mount which stands in the center of Kavaniras, the central and circumpolar Keshvari of the whole habitable earth. The various fragmentary allusions of the oldest Greek poets to Okeanos and the rivers would seem to imply the early existence, and perhaps early loss, of a similar Hellenic conception of the water circulation of the entire earth. Thus, according to Homer's familiar couplet, it is from Okeanos, in some application of the term, that all rivers and every sea and all fountains flow. Euripides presents the same idea. There is, therefore, one fountain of all the world's waters. The same conception is expressed by Hesiod in his Theogony, where all rivers, as sons, and all fountains and brooks, as daughters, are traced back to Okeanos. When we have a constant descending movement of all waters until they reach the world-surrounding ocean river at the equator, beyond which is the underworld. From this equatorial ocean, parting off from the southern or undershore, new branches diverge and form the river system of the Hedon kingdom. Other underworld rivers were perhaps conceived of as percolating through the earth and emerging to the surface in the lower hemisphere. There is at least some evidence that the Greeks, like the Persians, had this idea of interterranean watercourses, and even rivers, resembling the circulation of the blood in the human body. Sometimes these underworld rivers are represented as 4 in number, thus making the circumpolar water system of the underworld a perfect counterpart of the Eden rivers at the summit of the upper hemisphere. All, moreover, like those of the Persian underworld, seem to be plunging forward and ever downward, until in the last glimpse which the imagination can catch, they are seen streaming from the roof of the grot of the goddess Styx, and, as Preller expresses it, falling thence, beneath the earth, downward into the deep, deep night. Here, then, we have a unitary water system, embracing the whole earth, and the remarkable Homeric and Hesiodic term, aurorus, refluent, may well imply that the underworld, prohan, or outflow, returns in nature perfect order to feed its original fountain, thus conforming the whole in every part to the sacred hydrography of the Persians. Granting this, one should locate the Okeanos fountain not where Preller and Welcker and Volker and the other mythographers have hitherto placed it, but at the farthest north and in the sky. That this location was the original one is plain from all the local implications of the mythological accounts of the proper home of Okeanos and Tethys, and is further confirmed by many incidental evidences connected with such myths as those of the Eridanus, the Achelous, the birth of Zeus, and particularly those of Atlas and his children. In the most ancient Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylonian literature, there are expressions which seem clearly to indicate the presence among these peoples of a precisely similar conception with respect to the waters of the world. The same is true of Egyptian literature, but in both these cases the data are as yet too meager to make them entirely conclusive in argument. We therefore pass them by, and close with a glance at the Eden River of the ancient Aryans of India. This, as already seen, is the heaven-born Ganga. The Vedas call it the river of the 3 worlds, for the reason that it flows through heaven and earth and the underworld. In Vedic times, the original source and home of the waters was thought to be the highest heaven, the region peculiarly sacred to Varuna. This is clearly illustrated in scores of passages. For example, in the beautiful prayer for immortality, where the fourfold headspring of all waters is located in the sacred center of heaven. Sometimes the heaven-sprung stream is called Sindhu, sometimes Sarasvati. In the later Mahabharata, its headspring is placed in the heaven of Vishnu, high above the lofty pole star. On their descent, the ethereal warriors wash the pole star and the 7 Rithis and the polar pivot till the lunar orb, thence falling upon the top of beautiful Meru. On the summit of Meru, says the Vishnu Purana, is the vast city of Brahma, enclosed by the river Ganga, which, issuing from the foot of Vishnu and washing the lunar orb, falls here on the top of Meru from the skies, and, after encircling the city, divides into 4 mighty rivers, flowing in opposite directions. These rivers are the Sita, the Alakanada, the Chakshu, and the Bhadra. The first, falling on the tops of the inferior mountains of the east side of Meru, flows over their crests, and passes through the country of Bhradawasa to the ocean. The Alakanada flows south to the country of Bharata, and, dividing into 7 rivers on the way, falls into the sea. The Chakshu falls into the sea after traversing all the western mountains and passing through Kutamala, and the Bhadra washes the country of the Uttarkurus and empties itself into the northern ocean. Here again, as our interpretation of Genesis requires, the 4 rivers traced back to their origin bring us to the summit of the earth at the pole, to the one river which descends from the north polar sky. Curious confirmations of this primitive conception come even from the most distant continents. Late Christian legend shows evident traces of it, for in Mondeville's description of the Paradise Fountain, he says, "All the sweet waters of the world, above and beneath, take their beginning from that well of paradise, and again, out of that well and waters come and go, giving thus clear expression to the idea of a unitary cosmic water circulation." So again, in the apocryphal revelation of the Holy Apostle Paul, the angel who was showing the apostle the wonders of the heavenly city brought him to just such a world river, whose spring was in heaven, but whose main body surrounded the earth. "And he set me upon the river, whose source springs up in the circle of heaven, and it is this river which encircleth the whole earth. And he says unto me, This river is ocean."